Hi, I'm Kelly Kapic. I'm a professor of theological studies here at Covenant College on Lookout Mountain, Georgia. I've been teaching here for 20 years, and if you were here and we could take you around, you would see gorgeous views over the valley and the beautiful trees and the mountain and overlooking Chattanooga, Tennessee. And it's amazing, and college students come from all over the country and the world to study here, and you might think, what an amazing place. No one must ever get stressed out there. But actually, it probably shouldn't surprise you that college students are exhausted here. They work really hard, and they're trying to figure out how to do life well. And as I spend time with college students, one of the things I constantly hear is that starting in high school, they have just lived in an exhausting way. They wake up and head to school at 7:30 in the morning and are there until 3:30 or so. Then they head off to a sport or an extracurricular activity and do that. And then maybe at 6 or 6:30 head home, have dinner, shower, and then end up doing homework and other obligations until it's time for bed. And then they start the whole thing over. And they end up in college, next thing you know, and they're still doing it. And they are exhausted. But you're probably not a college student. So you're wondering, why are you telling me about this? Because my guess is whether you are 20 or 30 or 40 or 60 or older, we live in a culture that is frenetic with endless expectations, so much that we think we should do. And what we end up doing is we often feel guilty all the time. I don't know about you, but I often put my head on the pillow at night and I don't feel good about my day because of how much I wish I could have gotten done that I didn't. What about you? Do you kind of live with a low-level sense of guilt? Well, I'm very interested in exploring that because I think the way we try and answer that normally is through time management answers. Not just the world, but even the church. We feel the weight and the expectations and we think, well, we just need to do more. We need to be more efficient with our time. I actually am convinced that we don't fundamentally have a time management problem. We have a theological problem. And so I am very interested in exploring the idea of what it means to be a human creature. God made us with limits. And so I wrote this book, You're Only Human, how your limits reflect God's design and why that's good news. And why is it good news that you're a creature and you're not God? You're finite, you have limits, and you're not infinite. God alone is infinite. What does that mean? Have we bought into the pressure of efficiency and endless to-dos in ways that are really hurting us? I often think, I love efficiency myself, but efficiency is often the enemy of love. It's often the enemy of relationships. So what does it mean to be a human creature? And what's part of the good of that in the way in which God made us? So the book is designed around various questions. Let me just mention a few. For example, does God love you? Now, of course, the answer is yes, he loves us. We all say, yes, he loves us. I think that's easier said than actually felt and believed. Let me change the question. Does God like you? Does God like me? I don't mean this in just a Mr. Rogers kind of thing, but the reality is, what does God think not of generic humanity, not of ideal people like Mother Teresa? What does God think about you and your introversion or your extroversion with your strengths and weaknesses of whatever your personality is? What does he, not does God like your sin, but does God like you who he made in his image? What does that mean? That's worth exploring. That's worth thinking about. Another question is, what do you and I think about our bodies, right? We live in a time where there's kind of this pressure. On the one hand, we idealize and romanticize bodies and even make them into idols. And it sounds as if at times your body is all that matters. But then there's another extreme, sometimes in the church, where we belittle our bodies. We act like our physicality doesn't matter. And that's not healthy either. The reality is, how do we appreciate and honor the very bodies that I am here and not there? I can't be everywhere. I can't know everything because I have this brain and not all brains. What does it mean to have this body, and how do I think about it? How do I think about things like rest and sleep? Have you ever thought about sleep in a theological way and why sleeping is an act of faith? We explore that. That's worth thinking about. What about another question? What is God, how should you and I think about humility? Let's ask that question, right? Humility, we all know we should be humble, but as Christians, I think we often, especially in the tradition, we have confused humility and the reason why we should be humble as basically you and I should be humble because we're sinners. Well, I think we're sinners. I'm not questioning that. And I think the fact that we are sinners should contribute to why we should be humble. But let me tell you something. Even if you and I never sinned, even if there were no sin in this world, even if there were no fall, God made us as human creatures, which means from the beginning, you and I were made to be dependent upon God, dependent upon others, and dependent upon the earth. That's why we should be humble, because we're creatures. And the dependence, think about how negatively we talk about dependence and interdependence in our world, but actually it's part of God's good design. We need each other. And when you and I think so poorly about the idea of interdependence, it should be no surprise that we're cultivating loneliness, and it's really brutal on relationships. So what does it mean to be humble, and how can humility be a gift and something that's meant to bring joy rather than sadness? What about this question? You and I both know we know we're sinful. We know we struggle. We also have habits that we wish we didn't have. We wish we were, more developed people, however you want to put it. Why doesn't God just instantly change us? I mean, clearly there are things that he wants changed in us. Why doesn't he just do it in a second? Well, it's very interesting. In the creation narrative, God takes his time. Day after day after day, by his Spirit, he brings order out of the chaotic waters. Well, the God of creation is not a different God than the God of redemption and the God of sanctification. That is the one God. And God is comfortable and always has been comfortable with process, even when you and I are not. So how to think about God and how he views us and his commitment to us and to process. It's actually a beautiful thing. Similarly, what is God's relationship to time? Or not so much God's relationship, but what's our relationship to time? One of the areas I ended up researching, I didn't expect and loved and learned so much, was the history of clocks and how our relationship to time and how that gets related to the rise of stress and anxiety. And that's worth exploring. And I'll just give you a hint. The answer I would end up giving you is probably not what you expect. It's an exploration of the fear of the Lord in fresh and hopefully both ancient and contemporary ways. That's very relevant. So I invite you to enter into this conversation, not just to read the book, but to wrestle with these ideas, to talk about them with others, because my hope is that this is a path to liberty, liberty to actually rest, liberty to enjoy God's grace and to start to recognize his presence and the pace he's calling us to, liberty to love others well and not simply get things done. I invite you in. I hope you find the reading and the conversation worthwhile.